Okay. All right. We're here in Fairfax, Virginia, and we're interviewing Paul Warhaftig, who for many years ran the Conflict Resolution Center International out of Pittsburg, Pennsylvania. It's April the 28th, 2005, and we're fortunate to have Paul here because I think he's very genuinely one of the founders of our field, and certainly his book is one of the, On the Move Conflict, is one of the longest surviving textbooks for the field. So Paul, welcome, and thank you for coming and letting us interview you.
Well, nice to be here.
I guess there's a long story of your journey to alternative dispute resolution before we actually met. I know that you mentioned earlier when we were talking about your time in civil rights, and I know that you started out as a lawyer. So how did you make the transition from the law and civil rights into alternative dispute resolution, and why did that happen?
Well, I was running a bail reform program for the American Friends Service Committee. Mm-hmm. You know, like when you get arrested, you have to post bail. Sure. And we had put together a black community-based bail agency, and discovered other people in the state doing the same thing. So I gradually developed a network of folks and published a newsletter and held conferences. So I had contacts around the state and increasingly around the country. Meanwhile, on my committee, we had a program committee. I had an anthropologist, Michael Lowy, who was one of Laura Nader's students, mm-hmm. who had researched the informal tribal dispute resolution methods. I think it was the Ashanti tribe in
Ghana.
Ghana, yeah. And he came to us with a mission of trying to import this Ghanaian village model into urban American neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. I thought it was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. Yeah. But then it kind of sounded it out on a lot of people, community organizers and ex-cons and the kinds of folks that we looked at in those days as relevant. And they really liked it. Mm-hmm. So
this was about when?
About 1972.
Uh-huh.
So we wrote up a proposal, and we were going to do a pilot first project, mm-hmm. and then I discovered there were 3 programs already in existence, and they didn't know that each other existed.
Were these in New York? Which ones?
No, well, there was the then they represented the 3 models too. The Night Prosecutor program in Columbus, Ohio, the 4A program, Arbitration is an Alternative, in Rochester, New York, uh-huh. and a tiny little community-based one in the Community Assistance Program in Chester, Pennsylvania. Uh-huh. So I just started writing up those in my newsletters, and sort of played Johnny Appleseed with this idea of community mediation, and that grew into a national resource center for community mediation, called pithily the Grassroots Citizen Dispute Resolution Clearinghouse.
Good heavens, a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, I'm not very good at short titles. Our newsletter was The Mooter.
Right, I remember that, yes.
Which was pretty obscure because nobody knew what a moot was, the informal mechanism. Mm-hmm. So that was the basis of my networking domestically until about 1980, mm-hmm. when I ran out of funds. Or the service committee, the interest went elsewhere, so I was out of funds.
Yeah.
So we sat around and did some strategic thinking and came up with the idea that if you can't get funded to do a national resource center, do an international one.
Well, reasonable, yeah. Yeah. Did the idea work? Must have done for a while.
Well, yeah, for 20 years. Mm. And that's about the stage where I met you. And it really amazed me because at that point I was on unemployment insurance, kind of wandering around talking to big names in the field like Roger Fisher and you and John Burton. And I was amazed that almost all of them spent lots of time with me. I had a long interview with each one, except John Burton.
John always tended to be laconic. Yeah. Okay.
And you all took me seriously, and I took off from there.
Michael Lowy, his name crops up with several people now. He sounds as though at least his idea was very influential. What sort of a person was he? I mean, was he just somebody who had this idea and sort of dropped it into a fertile field, or did he continue with his interest? What happened to him?
Interesting. He, I'm trying to, he approached social change from a different perspective than I did. He tended to prescribe, this is what a program ought to look like, and let's go sell it out in the community. And I approached it as, here's a concept, let's give it to a community, and together we'll develop it. So he and I, well, he got pretty angry at me. He sort of thought I'd stolen his idea and distorted it. And the lesson he learned from that was, I mean, it's not necessarily the real life lesson, but the lesson as he saw it was that people listen to folks with a law degree and not anthropologists.
Oh, I see.
So he went off to Stanford and got a law degree and did public interest law work out there. And I've lost track of him since then.
Oh, gosh. That's, well, perhaps it's somebody that we ought to get in contact with and interview him. Okay, so the major thing that I knew about you before you actually came up and interviewed me, I guess it was at City University, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It must have been in London when you were on your travels. I mean, if you'll forgive my sort of injecting a little sort of personal reminiscence here, I think you were perhaps the second person to come through City University and talk to me about alternative dispute resolution. And of course, we'd never heard of it before in Britain. And the other one was this Australian lady called Wendy Fawkes. Did you ever come across Wendy? She was a wind from Australia blowing through the land, and wonderful woman.
Yeah, she floated through Pittsburg too. And yeah, we corresponded for years afterwards, sharing information, and she really got the Australian movement started.
Yeah, she did indeed. Yes, that's another person we have to talk to. I remember her bursting into my room at Sydney, from her university at Sydney, and came into my room in London and said something like, "Hi, I'm Wendy Fawkes. I've talked to all these people in the United States, and they're doing these interesting things. What are you doing?" And I mean, the answer was absolutely nothing in Britain at that stage. So, I mean, the other contact that brought us together again was the work that you and Hiskias Safer were doing about the MOVE conflict, and your book came out of that, and it's still something that we assign to our students and I think many others. How did you get involved in that? I mean, that was not Pittsburgh, of course. That was Philadelphia. How come you and Hiskias actually got into that one?
Well, it was a lot of stuff coming together. By that time, I was running the international center that I'd proposed, and my board met the day after the bombing. It happened to be our regularly scheduled meeting, and they strongly suggested that if we're if our business is helping people deal with racial, ethnic, and religious conflicts, here was one in our own state that ended disastrously, and we ought to find out why and what lessons we can learn from it. So I got a little bit of funding from a couple of Quaker foundations in Philadelphia, and I'd met Hiskias a couple of weeks earlier and had read his PhD thesis on the successful mediation of the Sudanese civil war. At least it seemed successful at that time.
It lasted for 10 years. I guess that's success.
So I knew he had the research skills that I lacked. So I talked him into joining with me in researching it. And it worked out nicely because he's a very thorough, analytical person, and I like to just kind of gab and get in. Well, I'm a kind of pack rat for information. Organizing it is another problem, but he was an organizer of information, and between the two of us, we managed to get a good readable book out of it. Yeah. And a preliminary report to the city of Philadelphia, which we put on a seminar there. You were part of that seminar.
I was part of the seminar, yes.
Yeah. So we wanted to be more than just a textbook. We wanted to really feed something back into the city with a problem. And I think we changed the analysis. Up until then, the analysis was that these people were too crazy.
Yeah.
To negotiate with. So what level of violence is appropriate for people who are too nutty? And I think after our seminar and distributing that, the conversation changed to how do you deal with people who you perceive as too nutty?
Yeah.
No,
in a way, it was a book that was well ahead of its time. I mean, because in a way, it actually took up the issue of what we call now, very trendily, competing worldviews, and how do you actually do conflict resolution with people who have totally different frames of reference. The tragedy of it is the lessons don't seem to have been learned much further afield than Philadelphia. And if you think about Waco, for example, and some of the other things that go on. But do you think it did have an impact on Philadelphia and the way in which they organised the relations with protest groups, because that's what I think MOVE was.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about protest groups in general, though they haven't bombed any since then.
Well, that's
but I do know that with the remnants of MOVE, which still exist in Philadelphia, that the city had assigned from the Human Relations Department a liaison person who has read the book, and they negotiated some things that seemed totally impossible earlier, like a homeschooling program for the kids that met both the academic requirements and MOVE's requirements. Beyond that, I haven't followed the developments there. People sort of expect me to be up to date on MOVE, and that's 20 years ago. So.
Yeah, it still remains of interest. I sometimes say to my students, we're always talking about peace building, after the violence, what's happened as far as the MOVE people, because they haven't all gone away or anything like that. So it is an interesting question. Say a bit more about your international centre in Pittsburg. How did that get started? And you actually ran for, I guess, about 20 years, one of the livelier, regular journals in the field, and that I think has been very, very valuable. But how did it all get started? I mean, you decided to go international, and then what?
Well, okay, decided to go international. I interviewed people like you to see if there was anything quite like that. And it was clear that there were international resource centers, but they were aimed either at the academic or diplomatic level, and there was nothing at sort of the citizen, non-professional level. So my next step was to see if I could get into a conflict area and see if people would see me as a resource or just an interloper. Mm-hmm. So we were vacationing in England when I met you, mm-hmm. and I took a side trip up to Northern Ireland, getting lists of people who were sort of in the middle, from Quakers and from historians.
For historians?
Yeah, well, I met an Irish history professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he had relatives, and people know people. Mm. And it turned out that's an amazingly easy one to get into because it's been so long that everybody knows where everybody stands. Mm. But people were glad to talk to me and quite willing to have a resource center that they could draw on, but that wouldn't impose stuff on them. Uh-huh. So that I went back and just started it up in the upstairs front room of my house. I had a mailing list from my pretrial days. Mm. I went to the first National Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution, partially to get the list of attenders. Mm.
Now that was, where was
1981 in Georgia.
Okay, yeah.
Athens, Georgia. So that gave me a reasonable mailing list, and I started another newsletter. Yeah, this time not the Mooter, but the
conflict
resolution notes.
Right. Yeah.
I'd learned to make it a more understandable title, and sent it out to them, and that became the basis. And then I organized, I think, by the iron wall of serendipity.
Always works.
just connections just take place. One of my board members was active in Partners for Productivity, I think, which is a relief or economic development project in Africa. And because of those connections, a South African came by, Harvey van der Merwe.
Oh, yes.
I met him at the Pittsburg airport, and because my board member thought I could fill him in on what's happening here in the States, which I did. And he was traveling around the world trying to identify conflict resources. So that made a bridge going one way, and the other way with the bridge is when he got back to South Africa, he wrote a directory of all these organizations, and he sent me a copy. And about 2 days later, somebody called up on the phone asking if I knew some conflict resources in, I forget what country it was. And I said, oh, of course we're an international resource center for these sort of things. And I picked up Harvey's directory, went through it, and there was somebody to refer to.
Right, okay.
And that was the beginning of my international directory, plus the contacts that you had given me.
It was a clearinghouse function. I didn't realize that you'd actually met Harvey at that time.
Yeah.
All right, and from that point onwards, people would do that sort of thing, ring you up and say, hey, tell me somebody to talk to in Germany or Latin America or whatever.
Yeah, there was that, and some kind of seeking out. I rapidly built up contacts in England because the movement was coming together then anyway, and They were pretty well tied in with Quakers, pretty much. I then wanted to move out onto the continent.
A bit more difficult.
Yeah, it was, but I got some funding from, let's see, how did it work? Oh, it was, I remember it. Yeah, it was a follow-up to the Move book. There was a group in the Netherlands who were doing a book on crisis intervention, and had Huskies and me do a chapter for it. And then they brought all the writers together for a seminar in Belgium to sort out style and have fun, I guess. And I got, that gave me a chance to shop around Europe a little bit. I got, I think, names, people to talk to from Adam Curl.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So it was a little more proactive. I went out and sat on people's doorsteps there.
Yeah.
It just sort of expands like that. One of those was Juan Gutierrez, who worked in the Basque country, with the Basque conflict.
Yeah. Juan, who became a friend of mine as well as yours, I think first came down to George Mason following the Ncpcr conference in Montreal. I remember it was a terrible snowy day, and this strange Basque figure suddenly appeared on campus saying, "Jim Lowy has invited me down." And of course Jim wasn't on campus. I was the only person in the institute at the time, and so we had him home here and sort of put him up for a couple of days. But the Ncpcr conference seems to come in very clearly to your activities. I mean, the first one down in Georgia, and I remember, I think it was the third one in Colorado that I met some of your Irish contacts that had come over. So how did you, I mean, you're wearing the T-shirt, how did you get involved in Ncpcr?
Actually, looking back, I was involved in it before it existed. Peg Herman, who really founded it, had done a previous conference in New Jersey. That was sort of a regional one, and that was back in the grassroots clearinghouse days. I sort of mau-mau'd them.
You better explain what that means to the younger generation.
I raised issues around doing a community dispute resolution conference in a fancy hotel in an expensive format, etc. And well, there's some funny stories on that, but they interpreted that they needed to have some community-based piece on the program, so they put me on as a speaker.
Ah, okay.
And I'd show up at all these planning meetings with my little backpack and my bushy hair and beard and etc. So knowing that they were only going as far as having me be the token community person, I showed up at the conference with my hair cut in a three-piece suit.
Did they recognize you?
Yes, grumblingly. Anyway, Peg has never forgiven me for that. She always points out. Anyway, where were we?
They were talking about the preparatory conference.
Yeah. So when the first Ncpcr came up, I attended, and actually I gave a little presentation on networking, and they eventually were going to have to face the issue that it was basically an all-white movement, predominantly white movement, and predominantly white male. And that, of course, took a few iterations of the conference to get there, but they had the problems.
It was a constantly recurring theme, I remember, when I was on the board.
So yeah, I served on boards and program committees, etc., all the way through. Rather than develop my own conferences, I sort of latched onto them as the vehicle to get the face-to-face exchanges going.
It, for a while, was the conference in the field. I mean, everybody went there. I remember being very surprised in the Colorado conference at just the huge range of people who were there. Diplomats, because the State Department was getting interested in this field, and people from the grassroots in Ireland. And for a number of years, it was the place to go and meet people. But then it seemed to decline, and I mean, it's gone out of existence now. Why did it? Nothing seems to have replaced it either. Why do you think it actually did not continue and go on, from strength to strength? So, I mean, is it?
Well, I think the times were changing. It needed to change. This is in the mid-90s. Well, a national conference is very expensive, both for the people putting on the conference and people going to the conference. Airline rates were going up. State associations were forming and putting on better and better quality conferences. So there was competition, the field was changing. I just don't think that one mode of programming that they were locked into could have lasted any longer. What happened was that we went through a integration diversity process leading to an inclusive organization, which means the culture of the organization changed, and with much more interest in diversity issues than conflict resolution issues, and took off on a new direction. And that organization, it's gone through two different names now. It still exists as a small diversity conference and resource group.
Yeah. Well, I do think maybe the field does need some kind of a focal conference, but I agree they're terribly difficult to run and terribly expensive.
Well, while it was going, it was wonderful. Going back to Juan, I had funding to bring him over to the Ncpcr the year you met him, which was in Toronto in the snow.
That's right, yes, I remember. Not Montreal, it was Toronto, wasn't it?
Montreal.
Was it? Montreal?
Yeah, it was Montreal.
Yeah, okay.
And his reaction was interesting because through most of the conference, he was very skeptical about whether mediation would apply to the Basque situation at all. And through most of the conference, he was, he couldn't quite understand why I'd brought him over there to sit through workshops on dealing with conflicts in dormitories and that kind of thing. But I put him on a panel with the Irish, and they'd been running mediation programs for about 5 years by then. And we're talking about what we now call building a culture of peace. And that was beginning to take hold. And all of a sudden, the lights went on in Juan's head, and he saw the connection with the Basque stuff, and took off. And
well, he went back from here, I know, back to Guernica and to the Peace Center at Guernica, and worked on that idea of a culture of peace there for a number of years. It certainly had an effect, I think, on some of the thinking in the Basque country, and it's amazing how you sort of put little seeds out and they suddenly find a tree growing. Okay. So here you are in the International Center at Pittsburgh. You're doing work with Ncpcr, and then Bill Headley at Duquesne University starts bringing some academic activities into the city. I know you had some connections with the Duquesne program, at which Bill started, and was there ever a strong connection between that program and your centre and the sort of grassroots movement that you were building up in that part of Pennsylvania?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, that started the way a lot of things do in Pittsburgh anyway. Bill came there with his idea of establishing a center for mediation, peacemaking at Duquesne, and everybody told him to go talk to me.
Well,
so
sensible.
Yeah, so I gave him lots of contacts and took him seriously, and as my mentors had done for me. And so we were never formally in an alliance, I guess, or in a bit. You know,
in cahoots is the word, I think, is it?
Well, yeah. There's no formal programmatic connection, but we just consulted with each other continually, and two things grew out of that. One just in terms of the community. He and that department teamed up with the Pittsburgh Mediation Center to train in our central black area of the Hill District, to train some trainers there to move the skills out into the community. And they ran into the cross-cultural problems that you would expect. The training workshop sort of blew up as the black streetwise trainees were saying that this is the middle-class model and it doesn't fit us. I think they called me in to sort of mediate that, and they ended up inventing a model for that neighborhood, you know, collaboratively. So that was one kind of relationship, and the other was, of course, that I think I managed to talk him into sponsoring the National Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution in 1997.
That's right. Yes.
So it was held at Duquesne University, and we worked very closely on that one.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about Bill's program, and I don't know whether it still does this, is it actually started out establishing some very strong contacts with Africa, with many African countries. Yeah. I remember being at a conference that I think you were there as well, with Hezekiah and a whole series of African bishops that they brought over, and I think they had a lot of students as well from Africa who did local work in Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
so,
I think each one of those bishops had was given a scholarship to parcel out in their country. So they had 29 bishops. They had 29 African students the next year.
Yeah, yeah, very strongly African for a while, that one. Okay, this is a sort of a rather unfair question, but it's a sort of one that a lot of people ask, I think, about alternative dispute resolution as a field in this country, and that's it's most strongly put, I guess, by Baruch Bush in his book about mediation, that it all started off very much as an attempt to empower grassroots movements and to let people find a way of dealing with their own problems. And reading some of the literature about what has happened to ADR since those early days, I mean, I think even including your own book, there's a sort of note of regret about the way it's gone, that it's become professionalized, it's being taken over, it's being institutionalized, it's being taken out of the hands of local people. I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly a lot of people feel sort of disappointed in what happened. You share that, or do you think it's gone the only way it could go?
Well, that's a whole book, which I just happen to have written.
Well, yes. I thought we might get some of your reflections on,
Yeah.
and then we will make sure that people know about the book.
Well, for the first place, you refer to alternative dispute resolution, and that's a term that I am very uncomfortable with.
Yeah, okay.
Because it implies that lawyers and courts are the main way of doing it, and everything else is an alternative. Some people use appropriate dispute resolution.
Okay.
The imprecision of our language
Well,
has been a constant problem here.
it's like private accounts or personal accounts, isn't it, as far as Social Security is concerned?
Yeah, whatever. Anyway, I wrote the book Community Dispute Resolution, Empowerment and Social Justice, and more subtitle. From the perspective that you just laid out, that I was concerned that at least the community part of the movement was founded by people coming out of the civil rights and peace field, and with a sense of providing a good service, but through that service promoting social change. And we mainly had a community organizing orientation at the start. So it was a way for communities to learn about problems in their community and get together and do something about them. I think there's sort of a natural progression in organizations that the founders have a vision, and then when that process evolves into an organization, the leadership shifts over to people who are organization maintainers, who the vision tends to fade, and keeping the organization going becomes primary. And I think the field has been going that way. What I discovered when I researched the book is it isn't quite a black and white thing like that. First place, we're talking about real community-based organizing. Was dispute resolution program was always a minority in the field anyway. But even within that minority, there's a whole range of activities that are social change oriented. It's not just community organizing. So to make a long story short, if you look at what's happened to training in community mediation programs, when they first started up, you trained people, so you'd have a roster of trained mediators. You were training your volunteers. With a lot of programs, it's shifted now so that the service is both providing mediation to people on the street and training people in conflict resolution in the hopes that they'll go into their institutions and use those skills, and it'll spread through society like the measles.
Well, hopefully more beneficially than that, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, and that's a social change model that may be more consistent with our anomic society.
Normless society, yeah. Disintegrating. yeah, we could spend a couple of hours on that
Yeah.
alone, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I sometimes think that we've contributed, we being the academics, have contributed to this by, the whole process of what one of my colleagues calls certification. The sort of need for degrees
yes,
and certificates and pieces of paper that you hang on the wall and one thing and another, and that's growing.
Yes, I don't qualify for
No. Well,
a lot of things because I don't have any degrees in
well, that's right.
conflict resolution.
Yeah, but you've probably got more knowledge and skills than almost anybody else in the field. So yeah, so much for certification. I shouldn't say that, of course, because my students are going to get up in arms and say, "Well, why are we bothering with this degree?" So what now? Where are we going? What's going to happen to the field? Can you put on a crystal ball and look into the future? What do you see happening? What do you see as an opportunity or as a concern?
Well, I see plenty of opportunities. I've been impressed with the staying power of this field. I mean, it's grown and expanded through a period of economic retrenchment, government funding retrenchment. In the early days, where we were looking to, like the Conflict Dispute Resolution Act of 1980, to some major federal funding coming in to really boost this field. It never came, but the field just grew, and it seems to continue. I think there's the danger that you hint at, that it's going to be consumed by professionals and become more service-oriented rather than change-oriented. On the other hand, with our society becoming increasingly polarized, there's sort of a wide open field of promoting dialogue, facilitating constructive conversations, getting the silent, I hate to use the Nixon term, the silent majority in the middle, helping them have a voice. Our society is in desperate need of talk, and who has the skills to promote that?
That's certainly a big job. Yeah. What about internationally? I mean, you went into the field and decided there was a niche there for an international centre. And as you look at the world of the 21st century, which we're now well into, what sorts of things do you think might be done in this country? I mean, you started the centre, it became a repository of information and help, and now that's come to an end, regrettably. So what do you think we can do in the unofficial sector, if you want to call it that, to help doing something about conflict resolution or conflict mitigation, or whatever the words are that we're using now internationally? Because it seems to me that anybody from the United States is in a very awkward position at the present moment to do things internationally. So have you got any thoughts about the future in that sense? I mean, what would you be doing now if you and I were 30 years younger?
Well, based on my philosophy of serendipitous planning, I have a hard time projecting. I was intrigued by there's a Global Partners in Conflict Resolution, I think it's called, project, which I'm not sure whether it's. I think it's going.
Mm.
It's a brainchild of Tongan.
Oh, okay. At the European platform.
The European platform.
Mm.
And I think it's a promising direction, although it seems to be going slower than he had expected, but not slower than I'd expect. And the idea was it's tied in with the United Nations.
Mm.
He's formed regional conferences with a supporting structure all over the world. I mean, he's had an Asia Pacific one, African, European, and he's purposely having all the other regions meet before the North Americans to try to equalize the input into it. Mm-hmm. And it's supposed to culminate in a world conference held at the United Nations this year.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But since I haven't seen any publicity on a world conference at the United Nations this year, who knows? I mean, that looks like a promising network form and tied in with a stable, somewhat stable international organization.
Yeah, something along the networking lines. But it is interesting that Paul's decided to sort of do us last, which I think is an interesting strategy.
Yeah, unfortunately I think he's also decided to do the mediators last.
Well,
well, we won't get into that. But
I don't know about you, but I'm getting to the point where I start looking back and thinking, well, it's been a longish journey, but an interesting one. But I wish I'd done something different at that particular point. Have you got any thoughts on what you would, if you were doing it all over again, what would you do differently? What would you do in addition? What wouldn't you do? I can think of several things I wouldn't do.
Well, I guess one regret is that when I retired, I had to close the center because I never built a structure to replace me.
Yeah. Well, that's something that many of us share, incidentally.
And that's partially related to the fact that I would never raise enough money to even support me. So more attention to structure would have helped, I think. Or it may be that the need for the kind of service that I was providing was pretty well
I'm not sure about that at
then.
all. No, I don't think there's anything that has replaced what you did. I think the field is poorer for not having it, very definitely. I just want to go back to one thing that you said earlier on, because I mean, my own experience of working in this field is that there are certain groups of people who've been very important in helping it develop.
Chris, that's a great point for us to start on the next tape. We're out of tape.
Okay, all right. Well, then I will make my point in. Are we okay? We're ready?
Okay, we're recording. Let me just see the camera one more time. That seems perfect. And just remember not to look at me, Paul, but to look at Chris. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, picking up on that question about groups and people who've helped to push the field forward. Several times in some of the things you've said, you've mentioned the Quakers, and my own recollection of the Quakers in Britain is that they were absolutely crucial in getting the field started there. Do you think that they played a major role over here in developing what we've agreed not to call ADR or conflict resolution or whatever?
Yeah, kind of a funny role. First place, they sponsored me.
Well,
So
that's one up for them, yeah.
Yeah. Well, everything leads into a story. Going back to Michael Lowy, who was not a Quaker. One of my follow-ups to his coming up with that idea was I put on a statewide conference on pretrial justice at that point, and Mike was supposed to be the speaker that summed up at the end, but he had a commitment or something, and so he ended up the keynote speaker. And we had this agenda on pretrial justice, and he just blew everybody's minds with this concept of community mediation. So we stopped the conference and put out some jugs of wine and replanned it for the rest of the weekend to talk about community mediation. At that conference were people from Friends Suburban Project in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And I think that's where they picked up the idea. And started a mediation program, and very rapidly they developed a training capacity, and they trained a good bunch of mediation programs in the Middle Atlantic area there, often for free, usually just for expenses, and so they really pioneered it. And if you look at least most of the Eastern community programs, there were Quaker women usually in the organizing. But by about 1980, the Quaker institution waned, really from other areas, and that's about when the Mennonites came in, and they established their center in Akron, Pennsylvania, and have really dominated the field ever since. At least dominated kind of the community and peacemaking end of the field.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that Bill Headley, I think, had something of a struggle to interest people in his own church of the idea of sort of, peace and conflict resolution. I remember he had to, fly a lot of what he was doing under the banner of peace and justice, which was a very sort of Catholic thing.
Well, you had that problem with the Quakers too, particularly the service committee. That a lot of peace people felt that the way you get to peace is to figure out who's the oppressed party, and you strengthen them to fight it out until they get peace.
Right. Yes, I remember sort of having a long talk with Adam Curl about this in the 1970s. He came out of that Quaker background as well, of course. Going back to Michael Lowy, he was an anthropologist, of course, and an academic. And one of the things we're interested in this particular series of interviews is, the influence of particular ideas. Now, he seems to have had a major initial idea on, a major initial impact from his idea on the development of ADR. Anybody else come up with useful ideas in the early days, do you think? Or was it all, let's try and imitate the Ghanaians?
Well, I mean, there was this whole stable of anthropologists who were saying basically the same thing as Mike. At least one academic that really influenced me and sold me on this was Richard Danzig, who was at Stanford Law School, a professor there. He went on to become Undersecretary of the Navy, I think, or something pretty high-ranking in the Navy. He gave a talk. He developed a model for community justice, kind of an independent community model for taking over most of the functions of the justice system. Very idealized, and community mediation was one of those pieces. And one of the points he threw out in his talk was what he referred to as the liberals' dilemma. And the dilemma was that liberals are wonderful, and particularly liberals dealing with the criminal justice system, are wonderful at analyzing the problems, but they also are wonderful at coming up with solutions that are dependent on the people in the system agreeing with them. So like a bail reform program, all the program can do is, in some way or another, tell the judge that it's okay to release this guy. And if the judge agrees, he's released. If he doesn't, he isn't. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And he pointed out that with the community-based mediation, you have the potential, maybe just a theoretical potential, of saying, okay, we in the community are going to handle X, Y, Z kinds of problems, and we'll let you in the courts handle ABC problems. I tried that that concept at a seminar at Harvard Law School and practically got scalped.
I'm not surprised.
But that really that hit me, and really became my major inspiration for getting into this field. That had that community empowerment potential.
Yeah. Because I've always had the impression over here, which is possibly a completely false one, that one of the major figures from academia who influenced large numbers of people through his writings, Roger Fisher.
Oh, well, of course, yeah.
I mean, all of my students used to come in when I first came over here, clutching their copies of Getting to Yes, and thinking that they had all the answers because they'd sort of read about win-win solutions and separating the people from the problem. I mean, did that have an impact, do you think, on grassroots people in the same ways that I think it had on my students, or was it? I mean, Roger always said that he wrote that for people at the grassroots, and I always wondered whether it had an effect on people at the grassroots. Certainly had its effect on his sales, anyway.
Yeah. I'd always thought the language was a little complicated for grassroots, but at least that first generation of mediators all carried around their little Bible there, and then his ideas were built into the community mediation training. So the ideas spread farther than the book.
Yeah.
But I think most of the trainers used to assign Getting to Yes as basic text to start with. Yeah, he was influential. John Burton.
Really?
I think.
Oh, that's interesting.
His needs analysis got spread fairly wide.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether that, I had that impression as well, but then, John was my professor and I've always been brought up in that sort of tradition. But it's interesting you say that it did have an impact, a wider impact than I thought. The other thing that, the other person that more recently seems to have had a big impact, I don't know whether you'd agree, is some of the writings of John Paul Lederach. Particularly his idea. I think John Paul goes back to the original roots of the idea of community empowerment, and this whole business about eliciting from people their ideas about how best to handle their problems, instead of sort of coming in with a, maybe like Mike Lower, here's how you do it sort of business. But again, John Paul's a friend and colleague of mine, so I may be exaggerating his importance and his influence.
No, I don't think you are at all.
Okay.
And he regularly would appear at Ncpcr, state conferences. His writings were broadly spread about that. I think people get a lot more out of talking with an ideated person, and no, he's widely known, and at least his elicited model of training is really accepted by a good part of the field now.
Yeah.
And well, anyway, I think we're at a stage now where when we first started this stuff and latched on to getting the yes, we had the answer. Okay, this is how you do it, and we taught that orthodoxy, with some exceptions, for years. And now we're at a fascinating stage where it's kind of a revisionist. If we're going back and looking at is the interest-based negotiation the model, or are there models, plural, and when do you use which? And I think it's a wonderfully fertile time now.
Confusing for my students, but I try to tell them that the job of the professor is to confuse them and get them to think about things. It's not an argument that they're very comfortable with. But anyway. Okay, you've looked back, you can look back as I can at the sort of the way in which the field has developed and grown. As you say, it's been exponential. And I'm still trying to see, well, I think you have the same expression in this country. It's difficult to see the wood for the trees, and I can see individual trees, but sometimes it's difficult to see how they all fit together to produce a field. We've talked about individual people. We've talked about Ncpcr as an umbrella organisation. We've talked about your role in the centre at Pittsburg as a node. Who else do you think? Where else do you think were essential organisations or events that pushed the field forward? I mean, looking back, what were real turning points for you in the development of the field? I mean, you saw this, a lot of it from the Ncpcr point of view. So, my colleagues sort of say, well, I think it was the Colorado conference at Ncpcr that everybody remembers as being sort of a major step forward, but maybe they're exaggerating again. I don't know. What were major steps and thresholds, do you think, looking back?
Well, let's look within Ncpcr and then outside.
Yeah.
And this is my perspective. Each one of those conferences left a mark.
Yeah.
But I think the pivotal ones, particularly from an international perspective, Colorado, because we had Peter McClatchin there.
From Northern Ireland, yes.
From Northern Ireland. He gave a plenary talk on cross-cultural mediation.
Yes, I remember that. Yes, looking at the Unionists and the Republicans.
Yeah, and that it's a wonderful model. I've used that in divorce mediation. You're thinking like a unionist, and you're thinking like a.
Well, I hope you don't use the labels.
Yeah. It takes them out of their own conflict, and they can see the dynamics in another one and then apply it back. I think the Montreal conference was, at least for me, the most pivotal.
Why is that?
Well, I was already bringing 2 or 3 people over from Europe, and there had been people Europeans at the previous 2 conferences, and the word had spread that this was interesting. So there were a good bunch of Europeans, and the Canadian aid, their foreign aid department came up with $15,000 in expense money for people from the third world, which the Ncpcr asked me if I would find them, get them there in 6 weeks.
Sounds like a bit like Ncpcr.
Well, and this was before email and all that.
Yeah.
In fact, before I even had a fax.
How did you manage?
I conned the library into letting me use their fax. They're used to going from branch to branch, and I was faxing Sri Lanka and India. They never figured out how to bill me. Anyway, so we had a mass of third world people. It was in the conference and sort of the follow-up session that I had with the foreign visitors that the idea for the European Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution was born. And just built contacts in Africa and India particularly that lasted for 20 years or so. So that really kicked off, deepened my international work. It established Ncpcr as not an international program, but a program that attracts internationals. What else it would be pivotal? I'm running a blank. Well, I think John Paul's work, which we just talked about, is major. Yeah.
What about outside Ncpcr? I mean, you just triggered something off in my memory about the European, ECPCR. And one of the interesting things is that went for 2-3 conferences and then seems to have petered out. The Latin Americans have tried to do
and went 4 conferences, I think.
4, was it? Yeah, I can't remember. And then a lot of people from, a lot of my students who come from non-North American or European backgrounds say, well, this is all very well, but we've never really made much of an impact on Africa or Latin America, particularly Latin America or the Middle East or Asia, which I think it's been slow progress there, I think. Or maybe you're more optimistic than I am.
Well, you kind of combine a whole bunch of things there. It sounds like with the European conference that you're seeing that tailing off as a symptom that things don't go.
I'm curious, because it's sort of, if anything, European governments are becoming more interested in conflict resolution and more willing to sort of support it financially, whereas there doesn't seem to be the same sort of surge of interest and activity in Europe as there was here. And I'm wondering, why that is, why people can't get themselves organised in quite the same way. Maybe it's the diversity of cultures. I don't know.
Well, one of the theories that I played up with some of my writings was that Europe never went through civil rights movement. Or the kind of peculiar peace movement we had in the Vietnam War.
No, that's true.
Both of which involved a lot of confrontation, but a lot of negotiation. And so I think that people were honed by as activists by that experience, and as a society in general that somehow makes them more open to figuring out how do you settle these things, as opposed to do it by the rules, which would be my characterization of a European approach.
What about... Sorry, go on.
Well, the European Conference in some ways suffered from the same problem my center did of never establishing an infrastructure. The structure was sort of decide on, look for a volunteer who will organize the next conference. And then they'd have to raise the funds and organize it and do it. And it was just an impossible load to put on the organizing parties.
Yeah. No, I remember, I'm a European, but I'm also sort of half American, so the cultural differences don't strike me as forcibly as they do others, but I do remember I can't remember if it was the first or the second one that the Europeans ran at San Sebastian. Did you go to that
Yeah,
one?
sure.
I think you
sure.
did.
Second one.
Yeah, and I remember the American contingent getting very, very uptight about the fact that the program changed every day. You know, they would go down to the sort of main hall in the palace up on the hill, and you know there would be the changes for the day up there, and the Europeans were perfectly happy with this and sort of laid back and not worrying about it. Whereas Americans were, you know, they've moved my panel, you know, or something like that, and total disorganization. You know, Europeans were quite happy with this; they didn't worry about it too much.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those who were upset with that should have been to the Bulgarian one.
Well, I didn't go to that one, so yeah. Well, maybe Eastern Europe is perhaps even more. What about involving the Third World in AD? I mean, you know, if you go back to Mike Lowry, that's where it came from. You know, it came from Ghana,
Yeah.
and yet it's very difficult to get. And the curious thing is, sorry, I'm talking far too much, and this is supposed to be your interview, but I will get to a question in a minute. I mean, the odd thing is that there's all this sort of reaction against North Americans coming here with their North American model and doing this, that, and the other. But actually, if you trace it back, it's a sort of Ghanaian model, returning to Africa sort of thing. But is it just lack of resources, or is it just that people see this as an American European imposition, or why are we making such heavy weather of it? And I'm also thinking about Latin America, because it's another story.
Well, your example, I think, is right on the nose for part of it. At that the Montreal conference had this debriefing session with the foreign visitors at the end, and everybody was saying nice, polite things. There was one Nigerian chief in his robes and his hat, and he sort of sat on the chair like it was a throne, and he said, "This is all interesting and all that, but we've been the subject of technological transfers that have been disastrous over the years, and so you know he's going to ignore it." And so I told him basically what you did in the question. You know, there's some history you don't know here. That this is our cultural interpretation of what we saw in Africa, and now you're looking at our adaptation. If there's something in our adaptation that might be useful to you, take it and run with it. And he remained a subscriber to my newsletter for 20 years.
Okay.
So, I think some of it is that kind of hesitancy, and we can also wonder whether the cultural gloss that we put on it is so Western that it just doesn't fit over there. You see articles now. There's one in the New York Times recently on forgiveness. I think in Rwanda. They're developing rituals so that they can reintegrate the people who did the slaughtering with the people who were slaughtered. And it's just mind-boggling that it happens, that it works. At least it's mind-boggling for us. Whether it's mind-boggling for the people raised in that culture is another question. I would think if somebody came into a Pittsburg neighborhood and said, well, if we want you to get together with the person who just shot your son in the gang thing, and they'll walk down a stick and eat a raw egg, and then they're cleansed. So we think these guys are nuts.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I know. I remember Jonathan Gosling, when he was doing his research in London, was sort of researching, I think, one of the Sri Lankan communities, and he was at that time very enthusiastic about this sort of put people around a table and things like that. And he said he discovered after a while that it just wouldn't work. That you could actually get some kind of conflict resolution by shuttling, and they did. But the two this is a sort of family thing. The two families wouldn't meet until there was a deal, and they would meet over a meal to cement the deal, and that was their model. It wasn't a Ghanaian / North American model. So I guess maybe this goes back to John Paul's point about you need to take notice of the local culture and adapt it, and not go in there with a one-size-fits-all thing. Okay, so let me go back and ask you a question that I've already asked you in a sort of slightly different way, which is if you had a large grant from a benevolent foundation to put some money into what you thought was the next worthwhile innovation in the field, what do you think? What would you spend the money on?
In this country, I'd spend it on promoting dialogue at all levels of the population. We're so polarized. Rational discussion is, well, the polarization really, there was an op-ed article in the Post-Gazette yesterday or so in Pittsburgh of drawing parallels between where we are and pre-war Germany.
Really?
That the right and the left are so far apart in Germany, with nothing in the middle, totally polarized, that's what opened up Hitler to come to power. So I think I can't deal with Nazi Germany.
Well, not
so
surprising.
if we're to avoid that future, our future has to be in opening up communications at whatever level we can.
Yeah. Okay, I think you're right. I think we're badly in need of that. Not just blues and reds, but within churches and etc. etc.
Yeah, and don't forget with the blue and red business, where Republicans are red states and Democrats are blue states or something like that. If you step back and you look at those states county by county, and take a step back, they're almost all purple.